It's 1992, and you're sent to Vietnam to save the almost 60% of kids that are at risk of dying due to malnutrition.
This is the incredible story of Jerry Stern, who in 6 months pulled off an impossible feat. He saved more than 2.2 million children out of malnourishment just by using 6 weighing scales. But the reason why we're watching this story is not to see a one-time coincidence and a one-time miracle, but to find out the deeply hidden web of ideas that we can use to replicate his results into our own communities, to bring about meaningful change without having access to unlimited resources and unlimited power.
To understand the story of Jerry Sternin, we need to go back to the end of Cold War, as the Cambodian conflict is coming to a close. And during this time, Vietnam had already been an impoverished and war-torn country, struggling to pay back its budgetary deficit. So the Hanoi regime decided to print money to fulfill its needs. We have a historic inflation of 1,000%, and the result was a famine that spread across Vietnam, kicking millions of families towards starvation and many more into severe malnutrition. Data collected in the 1990s showed that 45% of all kids in Vietnam were underweight, and more than 56.6% having stunted growth. And this is when the government of Vietnam decided to give Save the Children a call. But when Jerry Sternin arrived in Vietnam, he very quickly realized that he wasn't going to get the hero's welcome that he was expecting. Because he was one of the first Americans to come back to Vietnam, and this time he wasn't a conqueror, but as a savior. And even though the government needed their skill set to end malnutrition, they just didn't trust their intentions just because they were Americans. And that's why the brief they got from the government was very complex. On the one hand, they wanted Jerry to make them a sustainable nutrition plan, something that would continue even after they left. But since the government didn't trust him, they gave him an impossible 6-month deadline and an exit stamp on his passport. So, the race was on. Being given this impossible challenge would have been made easier if Jerry Sternin knew something about Vietnam, which he didn't. If he knew something about nutrition, which he didn't. If he had some money, which he didn't. All he was given were 4 weighing scales, 1 interpreter, and a few employees.
Jerry Sternin only had 4 working scales, so he quickly put them to use. He asked the village ladies to go around and measure the weights of all the 2,000 children in the village. When the results came back, an astounding 68% of all kids were malnourished and at risk of dying. To break down the system of malnourishment into its fundamental components, Jerry Sternin got around into the village and got a baseline of whatever the parents were feeding their kids.
Kids were fed twice a day, along with the rest of their family. They were eating from the communal bowl as much as they would like, and they were fed soft foods in the form of the highest quality rice in a soupy consistency.
He wanted to know this because the next step he took was so simple, yet that is where his genius truly shined. He wanted to experiment with an untested theory called positive deviance that he read a while back, and it goes a bit like this.
For example, within Vietnam, there are millions of families who are suffering with malnutrition. Positive deviance suggests that within this malnourished society, some people with the same lack of resources are somehow able to beat their circumstances and come out on top having healthy and well-nourished families. And if this theory is correct, the data should light up with these bright spots, and it was just the time to find out.
Fingers crossed, Jerry Sternin asked his female volunteers if they could find him some kids who are healthy within this impoverished village. And the ladies came back with the data, beaming with these bright spots, filled with kids who are healthy despite all the circumstances. All the team had to do now was to ask the mothers what they were doing differently. The mothers were feeding the kids the same amount of food, but spreading it apart to 4 times per day instead of 2. That meant that the malnourished stomachs could actually process the large amount of food. The mothers were also feeding their kids by hand instead of from the communal bowl. That ensured that the mothers could get their kids the right amount of nutrition even when kids didn't want to eat the food. They also added shrimps and sweet potato greens, which meant that the kids could get the required amount of protein and the right amount of fiber, even though sweet potato green was considered to be a low-class food for kids. The beauty of this insight is that it's purely local. This type of insight can only be found if you have the humility to go down into the trenches and see what real people are actually going through. Positive deviance shows us that the answers are right there in front of us. We just have to go there and get it. So let's understand the second half of this journey with the help of the switch framework suggested by Dan and Chip Heath.
The switch framework suggests that as human beings, our consciousness is like a rider who's sitting on an elephant. The rider is logical. It knows what it wants. It knows how to get it. But it can't use brute force because the elephant it's sitting on is afraid, it's emotional, it's moody, but passionate for meaning and purpose, and will go for miles without complaining.
Jerry Sternin wanted the villagers to feel that the change was driven from their wisdom, that it was their change. So he launched a program in which he invited over 50 malnourished families to cook each day in a hut. But the catch was that they had to bring their own food. And the only food you can find laying around in a Vietnamese village is shrimps, it's crabs, and it's sweet potato greens. And it worked. 6 months later, more than 65% of all kids were permanently rehabilitated from malnutrition, and they were looking towards living a healthy and long life ahead.
By making the process as simple as possible, he was able to teach the people from all over Vietnam this method. And this started a chain reaction in which graduates from these social laboratories took these lessons and changed their own communities. And it's not just Vietnam where the effects of positive deviance can be observed. Schools in California, for example, use positive deviance to learn about kids excelling in their studies despite their backgrounds and adversity. So in conclusion, you don't need unlimited amount of resources to solve the world's problems. You just need to keep a ear to the ground, identify the bright spots, and replicate it from the ground up. Thank you for watching.